Hello students, welcome once again to your spoken English lecture. Today we are going to do a story about a naughty woodpecker. What's a woodpecker? Woodpecker is a bird that drills holes on a tree with its beak. They make holes and those are their houses where they stay. So it's a very different kind of a bird. Now, here's the story. Not many animals moved into the hollow. Now, not all or a lot of animals live in holes. So it was quite a special day when Mr. and Mrs. Woodpecker and their son, young Walter, arrived. Now, it was a special day. Why? Because Mr. and Mrs. Woodpecker and their son, young Walter, they came to a place. Young Walter, they were moving into a large beech tree at the edge of the wood, not very far from where Mr. Squirrel lived. Now they were moving to a big tree, that is a beech tree. It's a beech tree actually. That is at the end of the forest. It is not far from where the squirrel used to lives. The neighbor is Mr. Squirrel. All the animals were excited about it and wanted to meet the new arrivals. Now, everyone in the forest was so happy. They were so into it. They wanted to see who their new neighbors were. तो यहाँ पे मिस्टर एंड मिसिस वुडपेकर और उनका बेटा यंग वॉल्टर एक नए जंगल में रहने जाते हैं. जंगल के एंड के पार्ट में वो रहते हैं, वहाँ रहने का डिसाइड करते हैं. वहाँ पे उनका नेबर है मिस्टर स्क्विरल. सारे बर्ड्स बहुत एक्साइटेड है कि वो लोग आ रहे हैं, हमारे पास नए पड़ोसी हैं. Can I get you anything? Asked Mrs. Waterfall, who had called on the woodpeckers. So, Mrs. Waterfall is asking woodpeckers, do you want anything? No. Oh, no, thank you, said Mrs. Woodpecker, popping her head out of the hole in the trunk of the beech tree. It's very nice of you to offer. And she says, no thank you, we are good. She put her head out of that hole that they made in the beech tree. And they are very thankful that the neighbors are very good. It's quite all right, said Mrs. Waterflower. I know as Mrs. Woodpecker once. She lived on the edge of the green wood, away up north. You don't know her, do you? Now they start a dialogue. वो एक दूसरे से बातें करते हैं. देखिए बच्चों, अगर आपको समझ में नहीं आ रहा है तो आप क्या करोगे? आप वर्ड्स को समझोगे. अगर आपको पूरा सेंटेंस समझ में नहीं आ रहा है, आप एक एक वर्ड को समझोगे तो ये बहुत इजी हो जाएगा. मैं ऐसा क्यों कह रही हूँ? हमारा ये स्पोकन इंग्लिश का क्लास है, इसमें हम इंग्लिश मैक्सिमम ट्राई करेंगे बोलने की, इसलिए मैं ज़्यादा हिंदी यूज़ नहीं कर रही हूँ. पर फिर भी अगर आपको कोई दिक्कत हो रही है कोई वर्ड समझने में, आप मुझे ज़रूर बताना, ठीक है? Now when they start a conversation, they are saying that, did you know Mrs. Woodpecker? She used to live in this place at the edge of a great wood. I don't think so, replied Mrs. Woodpecker. We come from down south. So she did not recall anyone from the north because they live in the south. That's the opposite direction. Oh well, I won't keep you talking, said Mrs. Waterfall. You must have a lot to do. So now Mrs. Waterfall doesn't want to disturb them, because when they come there, they're already tired, right? And they have a lot of work to do. You must meet young Walter, said Mrs. Woodpecker as Mrs. Waterfall turned to go. So Mrs. Woodpecker said, "You must meet my son." Mrs. Woodpecker shouted something in the hall, in the trunk, and in a moment a small green head appeared with very bright and sparkling eyes. Now, sparkling here, it means shiny, not like the stars, but curious eyes, eyes that want to see what's happening. Okay? So she shouted in the hall to call her son, and her son peeped out, means to look out of a hole. Now, the son had a green head and bright sparkling eyes. "This is young Walter," she said Mrs. Woodpecker. "Say hello to Mrs. Waterflower, Walter." So she is introducing young Walter to Mrs. Wallflower here. "Hello, Mrs. Wallflower." Young Walter said in a very polite voice, bowed his head, not bowed, bow. Bow means to bend your head a little bit, to show respect. "My, what a fine young fellow," said Mrs. Waterfall. Fall, Mrs. Waterfall, wishing that some of her own children were as well-mannered as Walter. So, when she saw and interacted with Walter, she thought that he's a very good person. She wished that her children were also that goodly behaved. After Mrs. Waterfall, many other animals called on woodpeckers that day because everyone wanted to talk to them. They all wanted to help if they could. And of course, they were all very curious to see the woodpeckers. Now, they were so excited, but they were also interested to know what's happening over there. They wanted to help them, but also know what's happening. "What a nice family," says Mrs. Rabbit to Mrs. Mole when they met the next day. "And what a police creature young Walter is." It's not a police, actually it should be a polite. Now they're talking that the family is very good and the child is well behaved. "Yes," said Mrs. Mole, "I think they'll settle down very well in the hollow." Yeah, they agree that the child is so well mannered, it's good, and they think that they have settled here very well. They are familiar with everyone and they have started being friends with the neighbors. On the next day, on the next Sunday morning, Mr. Squirrel was sleeping late, as he always did on Sundays. He was dreaming that he was about to eat the largest nut in the world. So, on Sunday, Mr. Squirrel was dreaming about nuts because squirrels love nuts a lot. So, he was dreaming that there was a very big nut and he was eating it. He heard a tapping noise. Mr. Squirrel thought he was still asleep and that the tapping was coming from inside the nut. So when he heard the tapping noise, tapping means tuck, 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 he thought that it's in his dream. There's something tapping the nut. Then he woke up with a big jump. And suddenly he woke up. He woke up and he jumped, not jump, like surprised. The tapping sounded much louder now and was coming from outside the tree. Why was it coming? Can you think, anyone? Yes, the woodpeckers were tapping the tree. "Good gracious, whatever is it?" he said out loud. He was like, "Oh my God, what's happening?" He jumped out of bed and rushed into the kitchen. So he quickly left his bedroom and went to the kitchen. "Did you hear that?" he said to Mrs. Squirrel, who was busy making breakfast. "What? That knocking sound?" said Mr. Squirrel, looking quite annoyed being woken up just in the middle of the lovely dream. Now, he's asking his wife, "Did you hear anything?" She's like, "What? I don't know anything. There is some knocking sound." He was not happy because he was having a very good dream and he had to wake up. "No," said Mrs. Squirrel, "I've been too busy to listen to knocking sounds." She was very glad that something had got Mr. Squirrel out of bed, because usually she almost had to drag him out on Sundays. So Mrs. Squirrel said, "No, I don't know. I've been busy. I don't know if there is some sound coming or not." But she was happy that Mr. Squirrel got out of bed early. Otherwise, she had to pull him out on Sundays. He was very lazy, especially on Sundays. "Well, you just came here and listened. Just come here and listen," said Mr. Squirrel, and he marched back into the bedroom with his wife. All was silent. Mrs. Squirrel looked at her husband as if she was rather sorry for him. Now, Mr. Squirrel told his wife, "Come with me to the bedroom. There is noise there." But when they went there, there was no sound. Mrs. Squirrel felt bad for her husband. "I've been dreaming." "You have been dreaming?" she said. Mr. Squirrel stood and his whiskers were twitching, as they always did when he was angry, but he was puzzled. Now, what are whiskers? Whiskers are hairs that are grown around the mouth, especially for animals like cats, squirrels, dogs. Twitching means shaking. Now, Mr. Squirrel was angry because his wife said that you were dreaming about that sound. He was also puzzled. Did I dream about it? Or it was real? "I wasn't dreaming," he said out loud, though Mrs. Squirrel wasn't listening. She had gone back into the kitchen. Two other very strange things happened that morning. One happened to Mr. Badger and made him so cross that he shuffled out of his house, slammed the door, and come to tell Mr. Squirrel all about it. Now, he told his wife, Mr. Squirrel told his wife, "I'm not dreaming." But she was already gone to the kitchen. Two other strange or unusual things happened that day in the morning. Mr. Badger also had something. He heard something or he had some news. So he shuffled. Shuffle means to move things around. Shut the door or bang it loudly. And he came to Mr. Squirrel to tell him about everything that happened to him today. "Mr. Squirrel," he shouted from the ground. Mr. Squirrel appeared on the branch with a piece of toast and a corn butter in his hand. So the neighbor shouts, "Hey, Mr. Squirrel!" And he comes out with food in his hands and mouth. "Hello, Mr. Badger," he said with his mouth full. "We don't usually see you out on Sundays. I want to know which rascal did it," shouted Mr. Badger in the worst temper than ever. "I have been having words with him." Now, Mr. Badger was very angry. And when the squirrel asked him, "What happened? I don't see you out on Sundays," he got angry, he got abusive, and he shouted, "Someone did this. And when I find them, I'm going to give them a piece of my mind. That is to tell them something very bad." Mr. Squirrel, who had not seen Mr. Badger so angry before. So, those two neighbors have never seen each other angry. He came down to his friend. "Whatever is the matter?" he asked. He knew that the squirrel knew that his friend was angry. So he tried to stay calm and ask him, "What's the problem, my friend?" "I'll tell you what the matter is," shouted Mr. Badger. shaking his great grey and black head, and with his eyes shining fiercely. Fiercely means with anger. Some scallywag has ruined my door. Now, Mr. Badger started shouting, you know what's the problem? Someone has spoiled my door. Some bad person. Mr. Squirrel knew that Mr. Badger was very house proud. He loved his house. He loved to show it off to others. Everything at Mr. Badger's home was neat and tidy. And only the week before Mr. Badger had made a fine new door of his house and painted it bright green. Now, it was just a week before when Mr. Badger had painted his house green. And he was a very clean man. He used to like everything clean. Good heavens, said Mr. Squirrel. Mr. Badger was walking backwards and forwards, stamping on the ground. So, Mr. Badger was walking back and forth angrily. He told his friend what happened. He had been walking away in his house that morning and had heard someone knocking at the door. The knocking went on, said Mr. Badger. Now I don't like to be disturbed when I'm working. And I was a bit cross. When I got to the door, there was nobody there. But right in the middle of the door, someone had carved the wood. Now, he told him what happened in his house in the morning. While he was working, someone came to his house and knocked it till there was a hole in it. Mr. Badger stopped before he said any more. He was so furious that he looked as if he could burst at any moment. So the Badger was very angry. Someone had carved, he said again, old Badger is a fool, right in the middle of my new door. Mr. Squirrel almost laughed, but he knew it was a very naughty thing that someone had done, and so he didn't. Besides, Mr. Badger was so angry, he might think that he had done it. Now, someone had wrote, Mr. Badger is a fool, on his door. So the squirrel almost laughed. He wanted to laugh, but he was a good friend of the Badger, so he could not do that. What a terrible thing, said Mr. Squirrel. He said, oh, what a bad thing. Then suddenly he remembered the knocking that had woken him up. But before he could say anything, Mr. Rabbit came leaping up the hill. Now, he also thought, yes, even I heard some sound in the morning. But before they could start talking, Mr. Rabbit came there, jumping up the hill. I don't know who could have done it, he said. Not you as well, said Mr. Squirrel. So even the rabbit is angry. And the squirrel is like, oh, I think it's not you, because something also bad happened to you. Do you know, said Mr. Rabbit, very annoyed, a piece of my living room ceiling fell right off this morning. So the living room broke in the morning. Even Mr. Badger smiled at this. And Mr. Rabbit was like, it's not very funny, looking rather hurt as his two friends laughed. He was not happy that his friends were laughing at him. It was just as if someone cut a piece out of the roof and dropped it into the living room. He thought it was like someone had cut a big chunk of wood and threw it in his room. I'm sorry, said Mr. Squirrel, but I can't help laughing. It's rather funny, you know. Mr. Badger's front door has been spoilt as well. So he's sorry, but they're still laughing. And he tells the rabbit that Mr. Badger's door is also spoiled. They've ruined the door. Mr. Badger shook his grey head. Somebody has been playing tricks on us, he said. I wonder who it could be. So now they are thinking that someone is doing this on purpose. Mr. Squirrel said nothing, but a rather serious look came on his face. He was thinking again of the knocking he had heard that morning. He walked around the tree trunk, looking at it very carefully. So he did not tell Squirrel anything. But he thought there was something fishy, something is different. Because he also heard the sound, so he walked there carefully. Oh dear, he thought to himself, for there halfway up the trunk, carved in the trunk, was a little drawing. It was of himself and had two very large teeth sticking out of his mouth. Mr. Squirrel said nothing to his friends, but he was also very annoyed. So when he saw it, what did he see? A picture of him with two long teeth. So he was annoyed, he was angry, but he did not want to show it to his friends. The three animals sat in the long grass and thought hard. No one in the hollow would do anything like this, said Mr. Badger grimly. Some animals can be naughty like young mole. Now they are thinking, who can do this? Not everyone is a bad person or naughty. Or my young John, said Mr. Rabbit, but they won't do anything like this. Now they're thinking maybe it's their kids. Mr. Squirrel had an idea of his own, but as usual, he wouldn't tell his friends about it. He told them to go home and he would do whatever he could. Now, Mr. Squirrel had an idea, but he did not tell anyone. He just said that, let's go home. Later that morning, Mr. Squirrel wandered up towards the woods. He walked slowly and whistled cheerfully as if he didn't care in the world. Before long, he saw Mr. Woodpecker with some soft green moss with a nest in his mouth. Hello, Mr. Woodpecker, he called out. Have you finished your nest yet? Now, after that incident, Mr. Squirrel went into the forest. He was behaving like nothing bad happened to him. That's when he saw Mr. Woodpecker. He had some moss in his mouth and they were making their nest. So he asked them, have you finished your nest or not? Oh, hello, Mr. Squirrel, said Mr. Woodpecker, flying down very nearly. Just a little more moss to line it and then it would be finished. So he's saying, yes, I am almost done with my nest. Mr. Squirrel chatted on happily about this and that for quite some time. Then just as he was about to go, he told Mr. Woodpecker what had happened to Mr. Badger's door, to Mr. Rabbit's roof and his trunk. Now when they were talking, he told the woodpecker what happened to him and his friends' houses. Mr. Woodpecker said nothing for a time. Then he said very sadly, I thought this would happen. It's young Walter who did it. He does it wherever we go. You know we always have to leave places because of the silly things young Walter does. Now, Woodpecker felt sorry. He said that this is my son's fault. He always does this kind of things and that's why we have to leave the place. Mr. Woodpecker looked very unhappy. He was sad. Now I suppose we'll have to leave the hollow, he said, and the people here seem so nice. Oh no, said Mr. Squirrel. We felt very sorry for Mr. and Mrs. Woodpecker. We mustn't leave here. Perhaps we can do something about young Walter. Now, he said maybe we have to leave now. You people are so good. He said, no, you don't have to leave. We can help you. Oh no, said Mr. Woodpecker. He's very naughty. His mother can do nothing with him. Even his mother cannot help him. Perhaps you haven't done the right thing, said Mr. Squirrel, with the usual bright twinkle in his eyes. He said, maybe you didn't do the right thing. He had an idea. We can see it in his eyes. Now I have a little idea. He whispered in Mr. Woodpecker's ear. So he said, yes, I have an idea. Mr. Woodpecker listened, and then a broad smile spread over his face. And the idea was so good that he started smiling. On the next day, Mr. Rabbit, Mr. Squirrel went to Mr. Badger's house early. They were humming merrily. Merrily means happily making sounds. Soon all three animals were busy at work, putting a fine new door on Mr. Badger's home. It was even smarter than the old one. And when it was finished, Mr. Badger brought a large tin out of the house. So after fixing the door, they thought of celebrating the large tin. Now we'll paint it, he said, and give a large wink at Mr. Squirrel and other to the Mr. Rabbit. All three of them laughed. So now they were going to paint the door. So it was a trick. When the painting was completed, the door was a fine bright red. The three animals stood back to admire it. Admire means to like it. So after completing, they thought that it's well and good now. My, that's a fine door, said Mr. Rabbit. Come inside, said Mr. Badger. Let's have some tea. Now they said, oh, the door is fixed finally. Let's have some tea. He led the way inside and closed the door. Mr. Badger didn't have time to pour the hot teapot when there was a bang on the door, but only one bang this time and no more. So when he was preparing tea, he had some sound, but it was only once. Mr. Squirrel laughed and said, let's go and look at that fine door again. At the door was young Walter. Well, he wasn't really at it. He was on it, stuck on it. As the door opened, young Walter swung in with it. His beak was stuck, his wings were stuck, his feet were stuck. So when they heard that sound, they went to see what it was, and they saw that Walter was stuck on the door. See here. My, said Mr. Squirrel, that glue is very strong, isn't it? Now, Mr. Badger, would you bring a pair of your slippers? I think young Walter may have learned a little lesson. So he's telling, yes, it was glue on the door. And now Walter knew what he did wrong. Walter couldn't say anything because his beak was stuck fast with glue. Here, his eyes rolled about on his head. Mr. Rabbit was helpless with laughter, and he was laughing. Don't worry, Walter, said Mr. Squirrel. Your father says this will be quite all right. And they said, yes, your dad also said it's okay. Now, let's see what we do. Let's summarize this story. एक नेबरहुड में जंगल में वुडपेकर की फैमिली आती है रहने. उनका जो बेटा है वो बहुत शरारती है. वो लोगों की छत तोड़ देता है, दरवाजे तोड़ देता है, लोगों को परेशान करता है. जब ये बात उसके पेरेंट्स को पता चलती है तो वो बहुत सैड हो जाते हैं और उनको ऐसा लग रहा है हमें यहाँ से जाना पड़ेगा. पर रैबिट के पास एक आइडिया है और वो क्या करता है, मिस्टर स्क्विरल के पास, और वो लोग क्या करते हैं, नया दरवाज़ा लगा के ग्लू लगाते हैं ताकि जब भी वहाँ पे वॉल्टर आता है तो डोर को तोड़ने की कोशिश करता है तो वो चिपक जाता है और इससे वो अपना सबक सीख जाता है. आज जो मैंने स्टोरी अभी समझाई है पूरी इंग्लिश में और अभी मैंने आपको समरी भी दी है हिंदी में, आपको क्या करना है, ये स्टोरी को शॉर्ट करके मुझे इंग्लिश में आपको ये बोल के अपने शब्दों में बोल के मुझे सेंड करना. ठीक है? आई होप आपको ये स्टोरी समझ में आई हो. दैट्स ऑल फॉर टुडे. बाय बाय.